The Vierock commander stood with his arms crossed, his four reptilian eyes narrowing in amusement as he watched the human team prepare for the mission. He had seen their kind before. Soft, frail, dependent on technology to survive. They boasted of endurance, but had no true strength. This mission would prove it. The crashed vessel lay deep within the canyon, beyond the jagged expanse of Gorath 7's unforgiving terrain. A world of crushing gravity, razor winds, and shifting stone. The Vierock warriors had prepared for a 3-hour extraction before the storm arrived. The humans had suggested 12. Captain Elias Monroe adjusted his gear, scanning the assembled Vierock soldiers. Towering reptilian bipeds bred for war with muscle density that put humans to shame. They were fast, brutal, lethal in short bursts. But they didn't know what endurance really meant. They thought this mission was a competition. It wasn't. It was survival. The first kilometer was a test. The Vierock surged forward, bounding over boulders, tearing through the terrain with arrogant efficiency. Monroe and his team moved with measured strides, conserving energy, keeping their breathing steady. Within the first 30 minutes, one of the Vierock stumbled slightly, adjusting his pace. Monroe noticed. The other humans did too. They said nothing. They just kept moving. The landscape turned cruel. The ground beneath them shifted unpredictably, swallowing feet with each step. The wind began its assault, sand and stone cutting against exposed skin. The Vierock slowed their powerful strides, turning into laborious trudges. Their kind was built for sudden engagements, not sustained effort. The humans continued unshaken. Their steps lighter, calculated. Monroe could hear the rasp in the breath of the closest Vierock warrior. He said nothing. By hour 3, the first Vierock fell to one knee, gasping. Another staggered, gripping his leg. Their leader scoffed, ordering them to rise. Monroe's team barely acknowledged the moment, pressing forward. The canyon loomed ahead. The real challenge had yet to begin. A transmission crackled in Monroe's earpiece. The survivors' biosigns were fading. The storm's speed had increased. They had less time than expected. Monroe turned back, glancing at the Vierock. 2 of them were already faltering. They were elite warriors, and they were breaking. "You need to stop." The Vierock commander's voice was sharp. "Your bodies will collapse." Monroe didn't stop. He didn't even look back. Not an option. The commander exhaled sharply. "You will die out here." Monroe glanced at him finally. The Vierock's skin glistened with exertion, his muscles visibly twitching from the strain. He looked at Monroe's team. Their breathing was even. Their pace unchanged. No sign of slowing. Monroe's expression didn't shift. "Then you'd better keep up." The canyon path narrowed, jagged stone forcing the team into single file. The storm, now visible as a wall of swirling death at the horizon, loomed closer. The final stretch would be the hardest. The Vierock warriors looked at each other, uneasy. The mission they once dismissed as trivial was becoming something else entirely. Monroe's team moved ahead, eyes locked on the canyon's depths, where their objective waited. The Vierock hesitated, but followed. By hour 6, the last of the Vierock collapsed. Monroe didn't stop. The mission was far from over. The Vierock commander watched in silence as the humans pressed forward, unfazed by the conditions that had already broken his best warriors. The storm howled on the horizon, churning up a wall of dust and razor-sharp debris, but the humans moved with purpose, their steps steady, their breathing controlled. The fallen Vierock were left behind, too exhausted to continue. It was unthinkable. They were bred for strength, for war. And yet these fragile creatures, these humans, had outlasted them. Captain Monroe barely acknowledged the struggle of the Vierock. His team moved with calculated precision, their pace unbroken. Hydration packs were past, energy supplements consumed. The efficiency of their movement was not just skill, but instinct. They had trained for this, lived for this. Every breath measured, every calorie accounted for. The Vierock commander pushed forward beside Monroe, forcing his body to obey. His limbs felt heavier, with every step his lungs burning, with the unfamiliar strain of prolonged exertion. "You should have collapsed by now," he growled between breaths. Monroe didn't break stride. "That's not how we work." The terrain turned treacherous. The canyon walls closed in the path, narrowing to a jagged rockslide barely stable enough to traverse. The wind funneled through the passage, screaming through the cracks, like the wail of a dying beast. Monroe's team adjusted without hesitation, shifting their weight carefully, moving with a rhythm that defied the terrain's hostility. The Vierock followed, but their steps were heavy, unbalanced. One misstep sent a warrior tumbling down the loose rock, his body slamming against the unforgiving stone below. He didn't rise. The commander exhaled a sharp curse. Monroe didn't slow. The distress beacon was close now. The survivors' signals flickered erratically, biosigns weak. Monroe checked his readings, his jaw tightening. Time was running out. The storm had accelerated now, less than 3 hours from their position. If they didn't reach the survivors, soon extraction would be impossible. He signaled to his team, increasing the pace. The Vierock hesitated, then forced themselves forward, but their movements were sluggish, their bodies rebelling against the prolonged effort. They were strong, powerful, beyond human capability in short bursts. But this wasn't a battle. This was a war of endurance. And they were losing. The canyon floor leveled out, revealing the wreckage of the diplomatic vessel, half buried in the sand, its hull breached, its support structure barely holding. Monroe moved first, scaling the twisted metal with practiced ease. The interior was a mess of collapsed panels and sparking conduits. His team spread out, locating the survivors trapped beneath the wreckage. A Vierock diplomat barely conscious, an Avaxi engineer whose breathing was shallow, 2 human officers covered in dust and blood. The rest were gone. Monroe keyed his calm. "We have them. But they won't last long." Outside, the wind screamed louder, the first waves of the storm arriving in a haze of grit. The Vierock commander staggered against the force of it, his movements slow, his body betraying him. Monroe's team moved with urgency, securing the survivors, checking injuries, preparing for extraction. The commander watched as Monroe lifted the unconscious diplomat over his shoulder, barely registering the weight. Another human did the same with the engineer. The rest of the team adjusted, shifting supplies, redistributing their burden. The commander knew what was coming next. A final sprint through the hellscape, before them, carrying the wounded with no time to rest. It was impossible. Monroe met his gaze. No words were needed. The storm had arrived. They ran. The wind was alive. It screamed through the canyon, howling like a starving beast, tearing at exposed skin, forcing sand and grit into every crevice. Visibility dropped to mere meters, the world dissolving into a storm of shifting dust and chaos. The Vierock commander staggered, shielding his face, his body nearly collapsing under the relentless force. Monroe didn't stop. His team didn't hesitate. They moved like phantoms through the storm, their steps precise, their breathing steady, their grip firm on the wounded they carried. The diplomat on Monroe's back was dead weight, his body limp, his breathing shallow. Every instinct screamed to slow down, to stop just for a moment. But that moment didn't exist. The storm didn't care. The mission didn't care. One of the Vierock warriors collapsed behind them, his massive frame hitting the ground with a dull thud. The commander turned, eyes wide with disbelief. His soldiers, the strongest of their kind, were falling one by one, their bodies incapable of sustaining the prolonged effort. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but the humans, those fragile creatures, kept moving. Monroe glanced back once, assessing, calculating. He shifted his weight, redistributing the load. One of his team members did the same. They took the burden without a second thought. The commander forced himself forward, pushing past the pain, refusing to let them leave his warriors behind. The storm intensified. Sand lashed at them, sharp as blades, scouring exposed skin. Monroe felt the sting, the slow seep of blood where his uniform tore. But pain was secondary. He had survived worse. He would survive this. The extraction point was still kilometers away. The route they had taken was no longer an option. The storm had swallowed it whole, turning the landscape into an ever-shifting death trap. Monroe adjusted course, leading them toward a natural rock formation that could shield them long enough to reassess. The Via Rock commander barely followed, his movements sluggish, his body failing him in ways he had never imagined possible. They reached the rock formation just as a gust nearly knocked them from their feet. Monroe pressed the diplomat against the shelter, checking his vitals. Weak but alive. The other survivors were in similar states. His team moved quickly, securing what little cover they could, taking deep, measured breaths. They had minutes, at best, before they had to move again. The commander slumped against the stone, his chest heaving. He looked at Monroe, at the other humans, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, their bodies battered, but still functioning. "This is not possible," he rasped. Monroe met his gaze, expression unreadable. "It's not about strength. It's about endurance." The commander exhaled sharply, eyes flickering to his fallen warriors, the best of his kind, defeated not by an enemy, but by time itself. He had always believed his species superior, built for battle, unbreakable. But now, watching these humans, he realized the truth. Power was meaningless if it could not last. Monroe checked his chronometer. The storm wasn't relenting. They had no choice. He adjusted his grip on the diplomat and motioned to his team. Time to move. No hesitation. No argument. The humans stood, shouldering their burdens, stepping back into the storm. The commander forced himself up, ignoring the agony in his limbs. He had mocked them once. Now he could only try to keep up. The storm consumed the world. The sky had vanished, replaced by a swirling wall of dust and debris that turned the air into a suffocating, blinding void. The ground beneath them shifted with every step, treacherous and unstable. But Monroe's team pressed forward without hesitation. Their movements were controlled, disciplined, every breath measured against the suffocating force of nature trying to bury them alive. The Via Rock commander struggled to keep up. His muscles screamed, his vision blurred. He had lost track of how long they had been moving. Time had dissolved into an endless cycle of pain and motion, of pushing past limits that should have been absolute. His warriors were gone, lost somewhere behind them, unable to continue. His mind rebelled against the truth. The strongest of his kind had fallen, while these humans, these fragile creatures, carried on as if their bodies had no breaking point. Monroe didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the Via Rock were failing. He had seen it before, larger, stronger species underestimating the slow, relentless grind of human endurance. The commander had once called them weak. Now he was realizing the difference between strength and survival. A gust of wind slammed into them, nearly toppling the group. Monroe tightened his grip on the wounded diplomat slung over his shoulder. One of his team members stumbled but caught themselves, adjusting without breaking pace. The Via Rock commander dropped to one knee, gasping for breath. His body refused to move. He had nothing left. Monroe stopped. Just for a second. Just long enough to glance down at the massive alien warrior, his body trembling from exhaustion. The commander looked up at him, shame burning in his eyes. "Go," he rasped. "Leave me." Monroe's expression didn't change. He reached down, grabbed the commander's arm, and hauled him back to his feet. The alien was heavy, nearly dead weight, but Monroe adjusted, shifting the burden as if this were just another part of the job. The commander tried to pull away. "You cannot carry us all." Monroe didn't let go. "Watch me." No more words. No debate. The humans kept moving, their steps never faltering. The commander, too weak to protest, allowed himself to be pulled forward, forced to rely on the very beings he had once dismissed as inferior. The storm raged around them, turning the world into a nightmare of shifting shapes and howling winds. But Monroe's team never wavered. Their bodies should have failed. Their muscles should have given out. The Vierock had been taught that all creatures had limits. But these humans, they weren't stopping. They weren't even close. Through the haze, Monroe spotted their destination, a jagged outcrop of rock where the extraction shuttle would be waiting. If it was still there, if they hadn't been left behind. His earpiece crackled, barely audible over the wind. The pilot's voice was strained. "Storm's pushing us back. If you're not here in 5 minutes, you're on your own." 5 minutes. With a full sprint, they could make it. But a full sprint wasn't an option. Not with the wounded. Not with the Vierock barely standing. Monroe adjusted the diplomat on his shoulder. His legs ached, his lungs burned. But he shoved it all aside. It didn't matter. Not yet. "Move," he ordered. Now. The team surged forward, dragging the Vierock commander with them, racing against a storm that wanted to bury them in the sands of a forgotten world. The commander had spent his life believing humans were weak. But as Monroe carried him through the storm, he realized the truth. They were unstoppable. The world was closing in. The wind roared with fury, whipping dust and debris into a suffocating vortex, clawing at every inch of exposed skin. The storm had become a living thing, relentless and merciless, swallowing everything in its path. Monroe didn't slow. His team didn't hesitate. The shuttle was close, just beyond the final ridge, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. The Vierock commander staggered, barely able to keep his feet. His body had reached its limit long ago, yet somehow Monroe still dragged him forward. He had stopped trying to resist. There was no strength left to argue, no pride left to protect. His warriors had fallen. He had fallen. And yet these humans, these fragile creatures carried on. They bore the weight of the wounded. They fought against the storm without a moment's pause. They should have collapsed by now. They should have broken. But they hadn't. The shuttle's beacon flickered weakly through the haze, a distant light swallowed by the storm's wrath. The comms crackled again, the pilot's voice barely audible. "Storm's getting worse. I can't hold position much longer." Monroe gritted his teeth. "We're coming. Do not leave." The ground beneath them shifted with every step, loose rock and sand conspiring to pull them down. A gust of wind sent one of his team stumbling, their burdens slipping from their grasp. Monroe moved instantly, grabbing the unconscious diplomat before he hit the ground. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He had carried worse. He had survived worse. Pain was irrelevant. The mission was all that mattered. The ridge was the last obstacle. A steep incline of jagged stone, the final barrier between them and salvation. Monroe adjusted his grip, planting his boots against the unstable rock. No time to rest. No time to think. He climbed. The others followed, moving in practiced unison. The Vierock commander tried to pull himself up, but his body refused to obey. He slid back, barely catching himself before he fell. Monroe turned, extended a hand. The commander hesitated. He had spent his life believing humans were weak, yet here was one offering him strength when he had none left. With a slow, grudging acceptance, he reached out. Monroe pulled him up without a second thought. The storm howled louder, as if enraged by their defiance. Sand slashed at their faces, biting into flesh, but the ridge was almost conquered. Monroe's arms burned. His breath came in ragged bursts, but he didn't slow. He couldn't. The weight on his shoulders was crushing, but stopping was not an option. One final push. His foot found solid ground. The top of the ridge. The shuttle loomed just ahead, its engines straining against the storm's fury. Monroe turned, reaching back for the others, hauling them up one by one. The Vierock commander collapsed beside him, gasping for air. But Monroe didn't stop. He dragged the diplomat into the shuttle, then the others, each movement precise, controlled, automatic. The pilot shouted over the comms, "We're at max limit. If you're not inside in 10 seconds, you're not coming home." Monroe didn't hesitate. He grabbed the last of his team, shoved them through the hatch, then turned, only to see the VA commander still on his knees, barely able to move. For a moment, their eyes met. The commander's expression was raw, filled with something he had never felt before. Not fear. Not shame. Something deeper. Respect. Monroe reached down one last time. The commander didn't resist. He took the offer hand and let himself be pulled aboard. The hatch sealed behind them. The shuttle lifted, engines roaring, leaving the storm to rage below. The commander slumped against the bulkhead, his breath still unsteady. He looked at Monroe, at the humans who had done the impossible. His voice was barely a whisper. "You are not weak." Monroe leaned back, exhaustion finally setting in. His lips curled in the faintest of grins. "No," he said. "We're not." The shuttle rocked violently as it tore through the upper edge of the storm, engines straining against the sheer force of the winds below. Inside, Monroe sat against the bulkhead, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but he forced himself to stay alert. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. The VA commander sat across from him, his massive form slumped against the cold metal. He looked nothing like the proud warrior who had mocked Monroe and his team at the start of this mission. His scales were dulled with dust, his breathing labored, his limbs shaking from the exertion. Yet his eyes remained locked on Monroe, unreadable, studying him in a way that no longer carried condescension. No one spoke for several moments. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the muffled moans of the wounded. Monroe's team moved with quiet efficiency, checking vitals, administering emergency treatment. This was routine for them. Just another mission. Another fight against impossible odds. The VA commander finally broke the silence. "How?" His voice was hoarse, almost disbelieving. "How do you keep going?" Monroe exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tightness in his muscles. He knew the real question the commander was asking. He had seen the doubt in the alien's eyes, the cracks in his certainty, the breaking of a belief system built on the idea that strength was everything. "You fight in bursts," Monroe said. "Short, intense, overwhelming force. That works when the fight is quick, when you have the advantage. But endurance?" He shook his head. "Endurance wins wars." The commander's jaw tightened. "Your species should not be able to do this." Monroe let out a tired chuckle. "That's what everyone thinks. Until they see it." The commander said nothing. He simply watched as Monroe's team continued working, none of them complaining, none of them slowing down despite what they had just endured. The humans should have collapsed, just like his warriors. They should have broken under the weight of their own biology. But they hadn't. They had carried the wounded, carried him. And now even after all of it they were still moving. The realization settled over him like a crushing weight. The VA had always believed themselves to be superior. Their raw strength unmatched. Their endurance greater than any species that had dared challenge them. But they had been wrong. The ship's intercom crackled. "ETA to command, vessel, 10 minutes. Monroe finally allowed himself to lean back, letting exhaustion seep into his bones. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the hum of the shuttle beneath him. The mission was done. They had made it. The diplomat would live. The survivors had been saved. The commander shifted, his breathing still uneven. "You carried me." Monroe opened one eye. "Yeah." A long silence stretched between them. The commander exhaled slowly. "No one has ever done that." Monroe studied him for a moment before shrugging. "Then maybe you've been fighting the wrong kind of wars." The shuttle broke through the last of the turbulence, and the stars stretched out before them, endless and unyielding. The storm was behind them, but the commander knew the real storm. The one inside his mind was just beginning. As the human team prepared for landing, moving as if this was just another day, the commander stared at them with something he had never expected to feel. Not just respect, fear. Because now he understood. Humans weren't the strongest. They weren't the fastest. But they never stopped. And that made them unstoppable.